The rain was coming down in sheets, soaking me to the bone as I trudged along the deserted road. My shoes squished with every step, and I was shivering with cold. But just when I was about to lose all hope, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, and I eagerly stuck out my thumb. The car pulled up beside me, and I peered in to see a friendly-looking middle-aged man behind the wheel. His eyes were kind and his smile was warm, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me as I climbed into the passenger seat. The interior of the car was warm and dry, a welcome respite from the relentless rain outside. As we drove along, the man struck up a conversation with me. I learned that he was a travelling salesman, and he regaled me with stories of his travels and the interesting people he had met along the way. He even offered me some snacks from his trunk, and I gratefully accepted, feeling my spirits lift. But then suddenly, a car careened out of nowhere, swerving wildly across the road. The salesman tried to swerve out of the way, but it was already too late. The two cars collided with a sickening crunch, and I was thrown violently forward. Everything went black, and when I came to, I was lying on the side of the road, dazed and disoriented. The rain was still falling in heavy droplets around me, and I could hear the sound of metal creaking and groaning in the background. My head was pounding, and I felt a dull ache all over my body. I tried to push myself up, but my limbs felt heavy and unresponsive. It was then that I saw the two cars, both mangled and unrecognizable. The salesman was slumped over the steering wheel of his car, blood trickling from a wound on his forehead. The other driver was unconscious in his car, the windshield smashed and the airbags deployed. I knew I had to act fast, so I forced myself to my feet, feeling the muscles in my legs scream in protest. I stumbled towards the nearest gas station, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. I burst through the door, my heart pounding in my chest, and told the attendant what had happened. He immediately dialed 911, and I collapsed onto the nearby chair, trembling with fear and shock. The police arrived on the scene a short while later, and I accompanied them back to the accident site. By now the rain had stopped, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and gasoline. The two cars were crumpled and twisted, and it was a wonder that anyone had survived. But when we searched the cars, there was no sign of the two drivers. The salesman and the other man had appeared to vanish into thin air, leaving behind only a trail of blood and destruction. The police searched the area for days, but there was no trace of the missing men. Rumours began to circulate in the town about what had happened that night. Some people whispered about alien abductions and satanic cults, while others speculated that the men had simply ran away. But the truth remains a mystery to this day, and the incident has become one of the most chilling and unsolved cases in the town's history. Even years later, I still think about that night. The memory of the accident still sends shivers down my spine, and I always wonder what really happened to those two missing drivers. The truth may never be known, but one thing is for sure, that night will stay with me forever. I remember the day like it was yesterday. It was a dark and stormy night, and I was driving home from a friend's party. I was exhausted and just wanted to get home to my warm bed. But as I drove down the empty road, I saw a figure walking in the distance. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, but as I got closer, I realized that it was a woman, standing by the side of the road. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should stop for her, but then I remembered how scary it can be to be stranded in the middle of nowhere, so I pulled over and rolled down my window. The woman approached my car, and as I looked into her eyes, I noticed that they were dark and cold, and her smile seemed forced. "Thank you so much," she said as she climbed into the passenger seat. "I've been waiting out here for hours." I tried to shake off that eerie feeling that was creeping over me, and I started driving. We chatted for a bit, but I started to notice that she would ask strange questions, like where I lived and also if I lived alone. I tried to keep the conversation light, but the more we talked, the more uneasy I became. As we drove, the wind and rain had turned into a storm, and it grew stronger as the wind began to howl. The woman suddenly grew silent, and I could feel her eyes were on me. I stole a quick glance at her, and when our eyes met, she flashed me a grin that made my blood run cold. "I think I've changed my mind," she said suddenly. "I don't want to go where you were headed. Can you drop me off at the next town?" I tried to hide my relief and agreed, but as we drove, the woman grew increasingly agitated. She would mutter under her breath and fidget in her seat. I was starting to feel like I was in a horror movie, and I couldn't wait to get rid of her. As we neared the town, the woman suddenly screamed, and I swerved the car off the road to avoid hitting something. I quickly realized it was a tree that had fallen during the storm, and it was blocking our path. And then the woman's screams turned into laughter, and as I looked over to her, I realized that she was no longer the same person that I had picked up. Her eyes had turned black, and her smile was twisted into a demonic grin. "You shouldn't have stopped for me," she hissed. "Now you'll never leave this place." I tried to start the car, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped with this demonic woman in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service and no way out. She began to chant something in a language I didn't understand, and I felt a cold fear grip me. And then suddenly there was a knock on the window. It was a man, looking like he had been in the storm for hours. He'd told me he was looking for his missing daughter, and asked if I had seen her. When I told him about the woman that was in my car, he grew pale. The man looked to my passenger seat and said, "What are you talking about? There's no one in your car." I turned around and saw that he was correct. There was no one sitting there. I described the woman and tried to convince him that I wasn't crazy, and that's when his already pale face grew even whiter. "I know about that woman. She's been dead for years. She actually died on this road in a car accident, and you're certainly not the first person to have picked her up." After he told me this, I just wanted to get the hell out of there. I apologized that I wasn't able to help him find his daughter, and then I tried to start the car again, and this time it roared to life. I didn't stop until I was miles away from that cursed road, but even now, years later, I still feel a chill run down my spine when I think about that night. Was it really a ghost that I picked up, or was it just my tired mind playing tricks on me? I guess I'll never know for sure, but I do know one thing, which is that I will never pick up another hitchhiker again. I was hitchhiking my way across the country, trying to see as much of America as I could on a tight budget. I had met some interesting people on the road, and I thought I had a good sense of who to trust. But one night, everything changed. I remember I was walking down a lonely stretch of highway, my thumb out and my backpack heavy on my shoulders, when I saw a car pull up beside me. The driver was an older man. He had a thick moustache and a gravelly voice, but he looked harmless enough, and when he asked me where I was headed, I told him I was trying to get to the next town, which coincidentally was in the same direction, so he offered me a ride. I hesitated for a moment before agreeing, but I was tired and it was getting dark, so I accepted. As soon as I got into that car, I knew something was off. The air was thick with a strange smell like chemicals or rotting meat. The man's hands were shaking as he gripped the steering wheel, and his eyes darted back and forth like he was searching for something. I tried to make small talk with him, but he only grunted in response. I looked out the window, watching the trees blur by, and tried to ignore the feeling of unease that was creeping over me. And then suddenly, the man pulled off the road and onto a narrow dirt path. My heart leaped into my throat as I realized we were heading deep into the woods. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer. He just kept driving, his hands gripping the wheels so tight that his knuckles had turned white. After what felt like hours, the car finally came to a stop in a clearing. The man then turned to me, his eyes wild and crazed. "I've been waiting for you," his voice deep but barely more than a whisper. "You're the one I've been looking for." I scrambled to open the door, but it was locked tight. I could feel the man's hot breath on my face as he leaned in closer, his hands reaching for me. I don't remember much after that. I assume I must have passed out or blacked out because the next thing I knew, I was lying in the woods, my clothes torn and my body battered and bruised. I stumbled back to the road, my mind reeling with fear and confusion. I knew I had to get help, but I was too scared to trust anyone at this point. Eventually, though, I made it to a gas station, where I called the police and told them everything that had happened. They searched the woods, but they never found the man. They only found a small pile of evidence, but they were never able to actually link it to him. To this day, I'll never forget the fear and horror of that night, and I know I will never hitchhike again. It was late at night, and I was driving down a deserted highway, trying to get home after a long day at work. I was tired and my eyes were heavy, but I was determined to make it back to my apartment before I fell asleep at the wheel. But then, out of nowhere, I saw a figure in the distance, walking along the side of the road. At first, I didn't even consider stopping. I had heard way too many horror stories about hitchhikers and the dangers of picking up strangers, especially in the middle of the night. But as I got closer, I saw that the person was a woman, and she looked like she was in distress. Her hair was disheveled and she was carrying a large backpack. I remember thinking I couldn't just leave her stranded out there, so I pulled over and rolled down my window. I asked if she needed a ride, and she looked up at me with her eyes wide with gratitude. "Thank you so much. I've been walking for hours and I'm completely lost." I smiled and unlocked the door as she climbed into the passenger seat. But as soon as she shut the door, I noticed a strange smell emanating from her backpack. It was musty and earthy, like soil mixed with decay. Are you okay?" I asked, trying to ignore the smell. "Yes, I'm fine. Thank you for stopping, I really appreciate it." Again, I just smiled, not knowing what else to say, and we drove in silence for a few minutes, the only sound coming from the radio playing quietly in the background. Every now and then I would steal a glance at her, but she was always just staring out of the window, looking like she was lost in thought. After a while, the road grew even darker, and the forest seemed to close in around us. The only thing I could see was the white line on the side of the road, stretching out into the darkness ahead of us. But then, out of absolutely nowhere, the woman gasped and grabbed my arm, screaming at me to stop the car. I slammed on the brakes and looked around, but I couldn't see anything. "What's wrong?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest at this point. "I don't know. I just had a feeling, like something bad was going to happen." I just sat there trying to calm her down when I suddenly heard a tapping on the window. I turned to see a man standing outside of the car, his face obscured by the shadows. "Can I help you?" I asked, rolling down the window a crack. The man didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at us with soulless eyes. I waited a couple more seconds and then quickly rolled up the window. "We have to get out of here," the woman said, her voice now shaking. We have to go right now. I started the car and peeled out onto the road, driving as fast as I could. But no matter how fast we went, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. After what felt like hours, we had finally made it to my apartment complex. The woman got out of the car and thanked me for the ride, and then disappeared into the night. But as I walked up the stairs to my apartment, I realized that I had forgotten something in my car. I ran back down to get it, but when I opened the door, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The woman's backpack was still sitting in the passenger seat, but it was now open, and inside I saw the source of the musty, earthy smell. It looked like a collection of bones, arranged in a neat pile at the bottom of the bag, and I knew in that moment that I had narrowly escaped becoming possibly another victim of this woman's twisted game. The police investigated my report, but unfortunately, they never found the woman, or any evidence that could link her to the bones in her backpack. It was honestly the weirdest thing, and I couldn't believe that I had gotten myself involved in it. And even worse, I couldn't seem to shake the feeling that she was still out there, lurking in the shadows, and over time I became quite paranoid, constantly checking to make sure my doors and windows were locked. Eventually, I decided to stop driving at night because it was too much for me. But even when I drive during the daytime, I'm still always on the lookout for anyone who might seem suspicious. I was stood at the bus station, my backpack at my feet and my eyes scanning the faces of the other travellers. I had been on the road for weeks now, hitchhiking from place to place, in search of adventure and new experiences. But now I was tired and ready to settle down for a while. As the hours passed and my bus continued to be delayed, my patience began to wear thin. I was starting to worry that I might not make it to my destination before nightfall. And if there's anything I learnt whilst being on the road, it's that during the night time is when the worst things happen. But just when I was starting to lose hope, a man approached me. He was tall and muscular, with a shaved head and a stern expression. He looked like he was quite no-nonsense, similar to my dad, and he asked where I was headed and told me that he was driving in the same direction. So when he offered me a ride, I gladly accepted. As we drove, I noticed that he liked to speak in short, clipped sentences, and he always seemed to avoid making eye contact with me. But I pushed all my thoughts aside, reminding myself that I had been picked up by all kinds of people on my journey, and he certainly wasn't the worst. But as we drove further away from the bus station, my nerves began to tingle. We were now heading down a long and winding road, with nothing but empty fields on either side. The man grew even quieter, his eyes darting back and forth as we drove deeper into the countryside. And then suddenly he pulled the car over and turned to me. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice low and trembling. "I just can't take you any further." My heart raced as I realized that we were alone deep in the countryside, with no other cars or people in sight. I started to open my mouth to ask what was going on, but before I could say anything, the man lunged at me. I barely had any time to react, my body moving on instinct as I fought to protect myself. I managed to wrestle him away, but he was strong and determined. By now we were outside of the car and he had pinned me to the ground, his hands rising up my body and approaching my head. In that moment I thought it was all over, but just when I was about to give up, I heard the sound of an engine in the distance. The man suddenly froze, his grip loosening just enough for me to break free. I scrambled to my feet and ran towards the sound, and that's when I noticed the headlights. As I emerged from the fields, I saw the truck approaching, and I flagged it down, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to explain what had just happened. The driver was a burly man with a stern face, but his eyes seemed kind. He listened to my story, and he actually called the police for me, who arrived shortly afterwards to take the man into custody. Strangely, he was still there, just pulled over on the side of the road. I guess he never assumed that I would be able to call the police from where I was at, but luckily I was. It turned out that the man had been on the run from the law, wanted for a string of violent crimes across the state. The police told me I was so lucky to have escaped with my life that night. But even now, years later, I still feel that same feeling of being trapped, alone and helpless in the middle of nowhere. To be honest, it's something that will stay with me forever, and I know I will never hitchhike again for fear of what could be waiting for me out on the road. It was a hot summer day, and I was driving home from visiting my family. I had been on the road for hours, and I was starting to feel the fatigue set in. As I drove down the long, deserted road, I saw somebody walking in the distance. I wasn't sure what to make of it at first, but as I grew closer, I saw that it was a woman, and she looked like she could use some help. Now, of course, I was a little bit hesitant to stop. After all, picking up a stranger on the side of the road was never really a good idea. But something about her seemed different. She didn't look like the typical hitchhiker you might see on the side of the road. She was dressed nicely, and she had an air of sophistication about her. I assumed maybe she'd got into a car accident or something and was walking to get some help, so I pulled over and asked if I could give her a ride. The woman turned and gave me a huge smile and immediately climbed into the passenger seat, and that's when we exchanged pleasantries. She told me her name was Samantha and that she was on her way to visit her parents. It was such a coincidence because I had only just left my parents' place, and so we chatted for a bit, but during that conversation, something about her made me feel uneasy. As we drove, the sun began to set, casting an orange glow across the horizon. The sky turned a deep shade of red, and the wind began to pick up. Samantha suddenly grew quiet, and I could feel her eyes were fixed on me. Is everything okay?" I asked. She didn't answer, and I could see that she was staring at something in the distance, just past my head. I followed her gaze, and that's when I noticed a figure walking on the side of the road. "Oh, should we stop and see if they need help?" Samantha shook her head vigorously. "No. Keep driving." I was a bit caught off guard with her response, but I continued driving. But as we went past the figure, I caught a glimpse of his face. His eyes seemed to be glowing red in the fading light, and it honestly sent a chill right down my spine. I accelerated, trying to put as much distance between us and that figure as possible, but Samantha now seemed unfazed. She just stared ahead, a blank expression on her face. As we drove, the storm grew stronger. The wind was howling and the lightning was flashing across the sky. At this point, I could barely see the road in front of us, and I was starting to feel a sense of panic set in. And then suddenly, Samantha spoke. "Turn left here." I hesitated for a moment, unsure if it was the right way, but then I did see a sign pointing in that direction. So I turned left and we drove down a narrow, winding road that seemed to lead almost into the heart of the storm. As we drove, the rain was pounding against the car and the winds were growing even stronger. Trees whipped past us and I could barely see the road ahead. But Samantha seemed calm, almost serene. Where are we going?" I asked. "To my parents' house," she said, her voice barely audible over the sound of the storm. But I could tell that something was definitely off. Her voice now was different, almost inhuman, and her eyes, once warm and inviting, now seemed cold and lifeless. I didn't know what else to do, so I just continued driving, hoping that this nightmare would soon be over. And that's when I noticed that same figure in the darkness, but this time it seemed to be walking towards us. I swerved to avoid it, but it seemed to be getting closer and closer. It was as if no matter how far we drove, it was always there in the mirror. "Samantha, what's going on?" I asked, my voice now shaking. But she didn't answer me. She just continued staring ahead, that same blank expression on her face. And then suddenly, there was a loud crash and the car skidded off the road. As I lost control of the vehicle, I could hear Samantha laughing, a twisted, maniacal sound. And that's when everything went black. When I eventually came to, I was lying in a ditch by the side of the road. By now the rain had stopped and the storm had passed, so I sat up with my head throbbing in pain. I looked around, but Samantha was nowhere to be seen. I stumbled out of the ditch and walked along the road, trying to find my way back to civilization. The car was nowhere to be seen, so I assumed she had stolen it, and I was angry at myself for ever making such a stupid mistake of picking up a hitchhiker. By now it felt like hours had passed, but I couldn't be sure. My head was still spinning, and I could barely see straight. But as I walked, I noticed a sound behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there, so I kept walking. But the sound grew louder and louder, until it was almost deafening. And then I saw her. Samantha was standing in the distance, her eyes glowing red in the darkness. She seemed to be beckoning me towards her, and I felt a strange compulsion to follow. I tried to resist, but my feet seemed to have a mind of their own. They carried me towards her, step by step, until I was now standing right in front of her. And that's when she lunged at me, her face twisted into a grotesque grin. I screamed and tried to fight her off, but it was like trying to fight a ghost in a dream. Every attempt I made at trying to get the upper hand seemed to just go right through her. And then everything went black again. This time when I woke up, I was lying in a hospital bed. The doctors told me that I had been found by the side of the road in a ditch, unconscious with a head injury. They had no idea how I got there, or what had happened to me. But I knew the truth. I knew that Samantha was behind it all, and I would never be the same again. From that day on, I never picked up another hitchhiker, and I always keep an eye out for Samantha, watching for her red eyes in the darkness, because I know that she is still out there, waiting for her next victim. And the scariest part of all is that I know I will never be safe as long as she is still on the loose. I was on a road trip across the country, and I had been hitchhiking for days. I was tired, hungry, and my feet ached from walking for miles. But I kept my thumb out, hoping for a ride that would take me closer to my destination. It was getting dark, and I knew I needed to find a place to sleep very soon. I was in a remote area with no towns or cities nearby, and my prospects were looking bleak. But that's when I saw the headlights in the distance, and I felt a spark of hope ignite in my chest. The car pulled up beside me, and I peered in to see a middle-aged man with a thin smile. He seemed harmless enough, so I climbed into the passenger seat, eager for some warmth and some company. But as we drove along, I started to notice that there was something off about this man, something that made my skin crawl. He was too eager to please, too interested in my life and my plans. At first I brushed it off as paranoia, but the feeling only grew stronger as we continued on. And that's when the man suddenly pulled over. I tried to open the door, but it was locked, and the man turned to me with a cold, sinister grin. "You're going to make a perfect addition to my collection." I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest, and I tried to break free from the seatbelt, but it wouldn't budge. The man then reached into his glove compartment and pulled out something. I knew now that I was in serious trouble. He moved back towards me, and I fought back with all of my strength. But it was no use. He eventually dragged me out of the car and into the darkness, and I felt my life slipping away with every passing moment. But just when I thought all hope was lost, I saw a glimmer of light in the distance. It was a small cabin nestled deep in the woods, and I knew that it was my only chance for survival. I mustered up all of my strength and broke free from the man's grip, sprinting towards the cabin with all of my might. I burst through the door, panting and gasping for air, collapsing onto the floor. The cabin was old and musty, with cobwebs and dust covering every surface. But it was safe, and that was all that mattered. I grabbed a lone chair that was nearby and I pressed it up against the door. I tried to catch my breath, but the sound of footsteps outside the cabin made my heart race with fear once again. I knew he was coming for me, and I had to protect myself at all costs. By now he was outside the front door, so I searched the cabin for any means of escape, but there was nothing. The windows were too small to fit through, and the door was too sturdy to break down. I realized I had trapped myself, and I knew that my fate was sealed, and it was only a matter of time. But just when I had given up all hope, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. I couldn't believe it. I was in the middle of nowhere. How did the police know where I was? Well, they pulled up and they immediately started rushing over to the cabin. They managed to arrest the man and charged him with kidnapping. Apparently he was responsible for a number of crimes around the area, and I was very lucky to have escaped with my life that night, and I knew that I would never forget the terror that I felt. I know in this day and age it's pretty much a given, but the one positive that I can take from this story is that hitchhiking is certainly not the way to go, and the memory of that fateful night I'm sure will haunt me forever. It was the summer of 1995, and I was just a college student hitchhiking my way to my hometown. At the time, I was on my way back from a music festival, and I was broke and had no means to pay for transportation, so hitchhiking was my only option. It was late at night, and I was getting tired and restless. I had been walking with my thumb out for hours with no luck, until finally a beat-up truck pulled over to offer me a ride. The vehicle did look suspicious, but I was relieved to finally have a ride and so eagerly climbed in. The driver was an old man in his late 60s, and I remember he was wearing a faded plaid shirt and a worn-out cowboy hat. He seemed friendly enough, so I took him up on his offer and he proceeded to ask me where I was headed. As we drove through the deserted countryside, the old man was telling me stories of his life, his family, and his travels. I listened politely, but there was something about his tone that made me feel uneasy. He had a strange glint in his eyes, and his voice was soft and eerie. And then suddenly, the old man took a sharp turn down a dirt road, and I felt my heart skip a beat, my instincts telling me that something was very wrong. "Hey, where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Just a shortcut, son," he replied, his voice calm but stern. The road grew darker and narrower until we were surrounded by darkness and the silence of the desert. And that's when the man pulled over and turned to me with a sinister smile. "You know, son, I've been driving down this road for years, picking up hitchhikers just like you, but the one thing you all have in common is you never leave." I felt a wave of panic wash over me, and I knew that I was now in serious trouble. I could see his plan unfolding in front of my eyes as he put his hand in his pocket to retrieve something, and I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed the only thing that was within reach, a bottle of water, and I threw it at his face, hoping to blind him and get away. The old man recoiled in pain, and I took my chance to unlock the door and jump out of the truck. I ran as fast as I could through the desert, with the old man chasing me and cursing under his breath. Luckily, I was significantly faster than him, and I didn't stop until I saw a light in the distance. It was a gas station, and when I arrived, I burst through the door, panting and sweating. The gas station attendant called the police for me, and they arrived shortly after. Unfortunately, the old man was never found, and I didn't manage to get a good look at the license plate, so as far as I'm aware, he's still out there. Now, I certainly learned my lesson the hard way, and I urge anyone listening to never hitchhike alone, because you never truly know who you might encounter on the road. Thank you for watching, and if you prefer the longer format videos, please let me know in the comments down below, and make sure to subscribe for more scary stories.